So the institute where I work is called the Healthcare Improvement Studies Institute. It's part of the Department of Public Health and Primary Care in the clinical school at the University of Cambridge. And our mission is to enable better healthcare through better improvement evidence. So healthcare improvement focuses on broadly enhancing the quality, safety, and outcomes of patient care through systematic changes and innovations. And we believe that that should always be based on evidence, like anything else that we do in healthcare, but also making those improvements, because sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And we have to make sure that we systematically get an understanding of what it is that works and what doesn't, and why that's the case. So we need evidence for that. So that's what we work on. That's our mission. We try to create an actionable evidence base for improving healthcare, working together with patients, healthcare staff, and other stakeholders in the healthcare environment. So in this lecture, we're going to discuss three topics. We're going to start with the truth about prediction models, which is that very, very few of them are actually being used in clinical practice, whilst many hundreds, if not thousands of them are being developed. Then we're going to talk about, what is it that we can do about that problem? More specifically, what is the journey typically from a healthcare AI algorithm from development into deployment into clinical practice, or what should that journey look like? And what do we know about it? And specifically in the last bit, we're going to talk about what is it that we know about the last stage of that journey, the implementation stage. We recently conducted a survey of recent literature on this topic within my group. So I'm going to share with you some of the findings from that literature survey. And we're going to finish with some take-home messages. And we're going to have time, obviously, for discussion. So you might have heard of this report that appeared a couple of years back in MIT Technology Review, which was about the COVID-19 AI tools that were developed during the pandemic. And there were hundreds of them developed in a very short amount of time. And the headline of this paper in the MIT Technology Review was none of them helped. And really what this was about is that none of those models was actually ever deployed in clinical practice. Now, I think that was a little bit short-sighted. So I think that the reality was a little bit more nuanced. Some of them were actually deployed. But by and large, from those hundreds of models, very few made it into clinical practice. And, people were critical of that because there was a lot of investment that went into the development of those models. And if then so few of them reach clinical practice, that's a concern. It means we've wasted our time and money on things that, are not going to benefit patients. What happened here in the pandemic was actually not so unique. So here's a review from 2016 by Emily Kleinhauerler and colleagues. And they looked at prognostic models in obstetrics. And they identified at the time, so 2016, 177 papers that reported the development of 263 prognostic models in obstetrics, so quite a few. And these models predict things like preeclampsia, preterm delivery, mode of delivery, gestational hypertension, those kinds of things. One interesting, and this is slightly tangential, but one interesting finding from the review is that the performance of newer models, who obviously were more advanced in terms of the analytical methods that were used, was generally not better than that of older models, predicting the same outcome. But really, the headlines of this review is that very few of these models were externally validated, and none of these models, so we're talking 263 models, none of those models was ever evaluated in clinical practice for its impact on decision-making and outcomes. And therefore, also no models are currently recommended by clinical guidelines, and they're not being used because they're not being recommended by guidelines. So this is just one field. Another review, a little bit more recent, from 2021 in psychiatry. Again, a review of the literature. In this case, I identified 88 prediction modeling studies in psychiatry. their inclusion criteria were a little bit more narrow, so they only looked at studies where there was some form of validation. That wasn't true of the other study that I just discussed. And this looked at conditions like psychosis, mood and affective disorders, anxiety disorders. And what they found is 27 models from the 88 had been externally validated, and only one model had been implemented in clinical practice. So in the previous review, it was none, zero. But in this case, one model. So these are really dramatic numbers. And it's a topic that certainly in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years has been discussed quite widely in the literature and at meetings. And if we look at, clinical or healthcare AI more broadly, which you can do with this dashboard. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's called the Global Clinical Artificial Intelligence Dashboard. Has a number of algorithms to basically scrape the scientific literature. And I looked at it when was it? Sunday, so 1st of September, so very recently. And at that time, the dashboard said, we currently have 82,000, almost 83,000 studies of clinical AI model development and 7,600 studies at mature development stage. So, for instance, a real-world evaluation, a randomized clinical trial, things like that. So that's, that latter number is 8.4% of the total studies. It's very small, whereas more than 90% is about AI model development. And we see it in the graph here below that, that number of development studies has really exploded in the last 5 years. But the number of mature studies is actually growing very, very slowly. It is growing, but not at the same pace, clearly. So this has led to some jokes also on social media on this topic. So this is a tweet from Maarten van Smeden, who's a statistician actually from Utrecht, where I am at the moment. And a couple of years back now, he had this tweet which said the truth about prediction models. And this guy here is saying, or this lady here is saying, tell me the truth, I'm ready to hear it. And he is saying, well, your new clinical prediction model, many similar models already exist, and none of them are used. And sadly, it is the truth. This is what's going on in the field of prediction models and clinical AI more widely. So the question is, how can we bring new AI algorithms into healthcare practice? And I think, looking at these reviews and the quite astonishing numbers, I think it's fair to say that this is not a simple problem, not something that just requires a technical fix. It's clearly a pretty fundamental problem that we have in our field, and which we have to consider very carefully, because surely not for all of these studies, but in a number of these studies, people must have had the ambition to bring their work into healthcare practice, and it didn't happen. It happened very, very rarely. So this must be a very tough problem. So in order to try to answer this question, we're going to look at what I call the healthcare, the AI, healthcare AI journey or algorithm journey, and what we know about that journey and what ideally it should look like. We know some things actually also more generally from biomedical and clinical research. So for instance, people have studied the processes for bringing new drugs and new biomarkers into clinical practice. So here's one framework that was published 10 years ago now, the Gannon framework, which has become quite popular and is used, for instance, by MRC, the Medical Research Council in the UK, and others. But there exist similar frameworks. They all look more or less the same. So this one, for instance, says that, that translational pathway from biomedical discovery to clinical implementation has four broad stages. The first one is discovery. So that's basic biological and biomedical research, very often not even with a disease focus, and certainly not even when it has a disease focus, aiming to produce something that we could use in clinical practice directly, far from it. But the results of that type of research might lead to something that we actually could use. So that brings us to the development stage, where initially we would develop some kind of proof of concept, typically in vitro development of a proof of concept solution. So something that works in the lab. And then if we have confidence that it does work, at least in the lab, we can further develop that into something that we could actually use in the real world. And typically there's quite a few steps required there. So once we get to that stage, once we've completed that stage, we can go to the real world and conduct some translational research. So now we're at D1, and there we could do the first test in humans, which is always extremely critical, typically as a pilot or a feasibility study. And if that's successful, if that works, we can scale that up and evaluate the efficacy of whatever it is that we have developed. Suppose it's a drug, for instance, the feasibility would tell us, okay, this doesn't just work in the lab, it works in the real world, at least in the sense that people respond to it, they can take it and things like that. But D2 is then is a large test, a rigorous test, a trial, for instance, of the efficacy of that drug. Once we have completed that, we can go to implementation. So deployment, initially at a limited number of sites, but later at a large number of sites and in a sustainable way. So this is what the journey tends to look like for new drugs and biomarkers. I think it has some relevance for our field, and certainly some of the stages that we see here, we would also see when we develop a new AI algorithm and try to bring it to clinical practice. But I do think that there are also some pretty fundamental differences. So in that sense, these types of frameworks, they have some value, but it's limited, I think, for healthcare AI. And I'll explain to you why I believe that's the case. So let me first go to a really interesting study that was published just a couple of months back. I think it was April in MPJ Digital Medicine. And this was from a group from Duke University. And they developed and then implemented an AI solution called Sepsis Watch at Duke University Health System. And it took them quite a few years actually to make that happen. And they realized that this is something that people very rarely report on. You very rarely see that people describe what it takes to make this happen. So they did it, and I quite like this initiative because it is so rare. So what they basically did is they conducted 20 interviews with the team of engineers and scientists that led the effort to develop this AI solution and bring it into clinical practice, and reported the results of those interviews as a series of swim lane diagrams that summarize the algorithm journey map across 4 stages. So problem identification, development, integration, and lifecycle development. And one of the things they emphasize is that the complexity, to a large extent, stems from the large number of stakeholders that had to be involved. So here's table 1 from the paper, which is a list of 18 different stakeholders, which were at some point involved in this whole process, and sometimes at multiple points. And I think it's a really important point that they make here that demonstrates the complexity of these processes. And then they provide these swim lane diagrams for the various stages of the process. I will not show them all to you. So this is step 2, development, which in itself is quite a complex process. And for instance, in the middle, I hope you can read that, it's pretty small, but in the middle, there's build, and validate the model in green. So that's just one step of this entire development process. And they actually expand on that in another diagram, what that build and validate entailed. And it's followed by design workflow and prototype user interface, which is also has its own diagram because it was an entire process of itself. So that's step 2, development. Here is step 3A, technical integration. And again, without going through all the details, but you can see here what the complexities are of making this happen, of integrating a new algorithm into an existing healthcare IT infrastructure. And there was obviously a heavy involvement here from health system IT support. That's the top swim lane, because they had a key role here in that integration process. So I think this was an interesting and quite unique effort to document and report on these complex processes that you have to go through in order to make this happen. And there were a couple of interesting lessons learned, I thought. So first of all, this translational journey for healthcare AI algorithms, I think, follows the stages of the software development lifecycle. That's not a surprise, obviously, because it is software. Then the algorithm development and validation are relatively small and relatively simple steps in the entire journey, because the complexity really emerges from the large number of stakeholders that are involved across this journey. So all kinds of challenges arise from the interaction with those different stakeholders. And the other thing I think what's really interesting and what is emphasized by the authors, and they're absolutely right here, is that this journey is very often totally unexplored terrain for everyone. So if you try to do this in your own health system, then you probably will not come across a single person who knows how to do it and who can tell you, okay, this is, these are the steps that you have to follow to make this happen. There's no one, because it's not being done. You will probably be the first. And that's obviously also the reason why it's so important that they have documented this process. For others, the process might be slightly different than how it was for them, but at least we now have a good and well-documented example of how it worked at Duke University. So I think, reflecting on what they found and what we know from software engineering processes, I believe that the algorithm journey for healthcare AI looks something like this. So it starts with an ideation phase where we get a thorough understanding of the clinical problem or healthcare problem that we're trying to solve, and formulate an initial solution and get an understanding of the data that would be available to solve that problem, to develop the solution. Then the second stage is the AI modeling. So selecting an AI modeling approach, do the AI model fitting and selection, and do an internal validation. So that's the proof of concept stage. Quite similar as we saw on the Gannon diagram. But now obviously it's all in silico, not in vitro. Then the next stage is model validation. So ensuring that this model actually validates also externally and generalizes, for instance, to other sites if we want to bring it to other sites. Then we have to develop something that in the software world we call a minimum viable product. So the model itself is obviously not something that healthcare professionals would ever use. We need to develop a product, a piece of software. So we need to design a user interface and develop a clinical tool which embeds the AI model and has that user interface. Once we've done that, we can go to pilot deployment, where we integrate that tool into existing systems and infrastructure. Integrate the tool also into existing clinical workflows, which is not the same thing, right? So the first thing is very technical. The second thing is all about how clinicians, how healthcare professionals do their work. Then we have to engage and prepare the user community, which typically will be healthcare professionals, to start using the tool. And they might, we might have to give them some training or demonstration of the tool. And finally, we need to evaluate whether, if we then do it, whether it works, whether people can work with that particular tool, whether it's usable for them, and whether they would do that, whether they would adopt it. And there have been pilot deployments where actually it turned out that that was not the case. And that's why it's so important to do such a pilot deployment at a small scale to figure out whether these things, whether they work or not. So once we've done that, we are ready for a larger scale impact assessment where we evaluate the effects, the impact of the AI model on things like clinical decision making, on patient outcomes, and on resources and costs. And finally, when we've done that and the results of that are positive, we are ready to spread and scale. So to go to other health systems or hospitals and start, developing processes for solution maintenance, because obviously it's a piece of software, so it will have to be maintained, and to ensure also there's business continuity. So there's some income stream which makes it possible to do that solution maintenance and scale and spread. If you look at, looking back to what we were discussing earlier, then you can see that most published research has focused only on 3 steps of the 7 that we have in this journey here. So that published research has focused on the proof of concept development, on the model validation, and the impact assessment. And proof of concept, that's, I think, more than 80% of published studies. Model validation, less than 10%, and impact assessment, also less than 10%. These are also the 3 steps where there is really good guidance and, for instance, very good reporting standards. So you might be familiar with the tripod AI statement, which appeared not too long ago, actually. So for anyone who's developing a prediction model or validating such a model, they would have to use a tripod AI statement as a reporting standard. And similarly, for the impact assessment, there's a very good guideline called Decide AI, which you may know. So these 3 steps, I think, are very well represented in research about healthcare AI, but the other steps, unfortunately, are not. And it's hard to say what the numbers would be. I mean, there are some studies that report on the other steps, but I think, in terms of the overall numbers, we're pretty close. We're definitely in single digits, and in some cases, very close to 0. Like I said, there's been a lot of people who have written about this problem and have suggested solutions. One of them is Florian Markowitz, who is also one of the faculty members of the CCAIM. And you might want to look up this paper because it's really good and very funny, and also strongly rooted in Florian's own experiences. And the headline is already quite funny. So all models are wrong and yours are useless because they're not being used. And Florian then gives some observations and tips for making clinical prediction models impactful for patients. And he's got 5 observations. So success in academia is not the same as success in the clinic. In fact, it's fundamentally different. Successful models use data that are available in routine practice, which is a severe limitation, but he's absolutely right. If your model uses data that is not available in clinical practice, in routine clinical practice, people can't use your model. Successful models are linked to actions. Again, I think a really important point, which remarkably is very often overlooked. Successful models are implemented outside centers of excellence, which is something that you wouldn't expect, but that's how it works indeed. And success in the clinic is hard earned. And the paper also has a checklist for useful clinical prediction tools. I will not talk you through all the points, but one thing that Florian is really emphasizing here is that whatever it is that you develop, you have to make sure that it addresses a very clear clinical decision point. And that seems obvious, but it's so hard to get it right. So it's the first point on the checklist. And then number 3 is, do you address a clear clinical decision point? Are you sure? And he says, better go and talk to a clinical collaborator who's a domain expert. Then number 5 on the checklist is, Do you address a clear clinical decision point? Are you really, really sure? Better go and get advice from a large and diverse group of experts and stakeholders. And I couldn't agree more. It's absolutely true. And it's so hard. And you have to do this before you even start. You have to get it right before you even start developing your model. So let's go back to our journey briefly. And there's interesting writings on these topics as well from a colleague in my field in informatics called Enrico Collera. He works in Sydney, Macquarie University. And Enrico tends to look at the journey until the point where we can do the impact assessment as composed of 3 stages. So the first mile is the ideation stage. And then the proof of concept, the model validation, and the minimum viable product is the middle mile, which is the technical bit. And then the pilot deployment is the last mile. And what he says is the first mile, and especially the last mile, are the hard bits, because that's where AI meets reality. And it's no longer just about technology, it's about people, and it's about organizations, and about social structures, and making sure that somehow the technology interacts with all those things in the right way. Really, really hard and under-researched, unfortunately. So I'm going to finish with an overview of a recent literature survey that we did on this topic, specifically looking at that last mile. So the healthcare AI implementation stage. What is it that we know about that stage? So what we did is search PubMed and Scopus for publications in 2022 and 2023 that focused on healthcare AI, clinical decision support, and implementation research. And we identified a total of 31 papers. Some of those were original studies, others were reviews, and we included both of those types of papers. And then we categorized them into 4 groups. So papers about implementation theories and frameworks, papers about stakeholder perspectives, papers about implementation feasibility, and papers about technical infrastructure. So let me talk you through each of these 4 groups. So first, the implementation theories and frameworks. And the thing to note there is that there exists a wide variety of published implementation theories and frameworks, some of which for healthcare, for the healthcare environment, some of which are very mature and have been very, very well studied. So they incorporate lots and lots of insights that we already have when it comes to implementation. It is true that mostly these theories and frameworks were not specifically developed for AI or healthcare AI, but they would still be applicable. Interestingly, when we looked at published papers, we found that they are very rarely used in healthcare AI implementation research. And whenever they were used, sometimes some remarkable mistakes were being made. So for instance, we saw that several studies that we came across used something called the Technology Acceptance Framework, which was developed in 1989 and has been superseded by newer frameworks like the Unified Theory of Acceptance and Use of Technology that was developed in 2003. Remember, we looked at studies published in 2022 and 2023, so 20 years later, and people used something that is clearly outdated. So there's clearly room for improvement here with, building better on the existing implementation theories and frameworks. Then the second group were stakeholder perspectives, papers describing stakeholder perspectives. And this was the largest group. So we found many, many papers, many studies assessing the perspectives of stakeholders on healthcare AI. And typically they did that through surveys, interviews, and focus groups. Mostly these studies were conducted prior to development of a concrete solution. So they basically assessed the general acceptability of healthcare AI by these different stakeholders. So the studies were not also really not also on the algorithm journey. They were done outside of the journey, you could say. There were many barriers that were cited in different studies, and common barriers were, for instance, fears of disruption to clinical workflows. This one was mentioned very, very often. It's the one thing that clinicians really, really hate, that there's a new tool or something else that they should start doing, but it completely disrupts the way that they're used to working. Related to that, fears of just generally increased workload. So you have to realize the healthcare workforce is completely stressed and overloaded. So they can't have an increased workload. It's impossible. Then also a lack of trust and a lack of familiarity with the technology. And finally, a lack of evidence for healthcare AI and medical decision support systems based on AI. So as long as there's no hard evidence that these things really help, people are reluctant to start using them. And the one thing to note that in this large group of studies is that most studies only interviewed or surveyed healthcare professionals and other stakeholder groups. So for instance, healthcare decision makers, healthcare commissioners, healthcare insurers, healthcare regulators were very poorly represented. And I personally think that those groups might be more important than healthcare professionals. So again, there's something that can be improved here. Those other stakeholder groups, we should talk to them. Then the third group was about implementation feasibility. So these were studies that evaluated the feasibility of healthcare AI implementation, that extremely critical stage. It was actually just a handful of studies that we identified. So this is not something that people report on very often, perhaps because it just doesn't happen. In the studies that were conducted, there was often a poor interoperability between the AI solution and existing clinical systems. And, that sometimes killed the pilot, really. In some studies, the clinicians were not satisfied with the accuracy of the AI algorithm outputs, and for that reason also stopped using it. And it wasn't always clear why that was the case, but in some cases it could be traced back to poor data quality in existing clinical systems. And I think the story behind this is that very often we develop AI models based on research quality data, which makes sense. But then once you bring that model to the real world, it will have to work with poor quality data we have in real world clinical systems. And then the performance of that algorithm might degrade very quickly. So these are, I think, very useful insight. And it's a shame that so few studies are being conducted or so few studies are being reported on. I don't know, because these are clearly insights that everyone who works in this area and is serious about bringing things to frontline clinical practice should be aware of. So the last group of our survey then was about technical infrastructure. Again, this was only a handful of studies, but I thought they were very interesting. What we found in these studies that healthcare organizations very often lack the technical infrastructure and processes for integrating AI solutions. And that's then also causing lots of delays. There were specifically very long delays in approvals to exchange protected health information. So suppose, for instance, that there was an external party, a company, for instance, or university, external to the healthcare organization that needed to access protected health information, sensitive health information, then this is typically a very, very long and arduous process to get that signed off within the healthcare organization, within the hospital. And then further delays were very often caused by cybersecurity concerns. And in this case, it was typically the IT support department within the healthcare organization that caused the delay. And was concerned that getting the AI model integrated could create some cybersecurity issues. So let me finish with what I believe are the take-home messages from what we have discussed. And I've got 3 of them. So I think until today, most healthcare AI investment has focused on improving algorithm performance and on developing proof of concepts. But they haven't focused on delivering real-world impact. And for that reason, we've also not seen it. The healthcare algorithm journey, which we have discussed, is complex. And it probably varies also from one case to the next. So it's not one journey, but there are general structures, I think, and lessons. But the most challenging stages tend to occur early. So in understanding the problem, what Enrico Coyera calls the first mile, and at late stages, what Enrico calls the last mile, so integration into healthcare practice. And especially that last bit, but also I think the former bit, the first mile, is where research is really still in its infancy. So it's rarely reported if it is being done, and it's poorly rooted in existing theories. And I think really we should become serious about seeing this as a field of research in its own right, so that it can grow and mature, and that everyone can benefit from insights that were obtained at other sites, and that we can actually better at it. And at some point, integration of AI algorithms in healthcare practice is not such a tremendous challenge anymore. So I've summarized the references here on this slide. I'm happy to obviously share my slide. I will do that via here. And I'd like to thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Chris and Peak. I think that was like really eye-opening to see that there's this huge disparity of like what we see in academia and what's actually making impact in the real world. And I think we've got quite a few questions in the chat. So what I'll do is I guess I'll call on the person and they can unmute and ask you the question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So we've got the first question from Aya, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yes. Hi. Was a great talk. I think you partly answered my question in the rest of your talk, but I'll go back to it. So assuming that someone starts a research project or wants, with the aim of the model ultimately being used in a clinical practice, then you suggest that he needs to take that into consideration right from the beginning, like considering which features to use or what data to train the model on, and even incorporate physicians in the process. Like from the start, you need to consider that you want this to be used in a clinical setting.
Yeah, definitely so. Yes, and thanks for that point, Aya. Yes, I firmly believe that is what you have to do. Involve critical stakeholders from the very start, and then look ahead. So look at, what is going to happen if we were to truly integrate this into clinical practice, and is it addressing a problem that people really have and recognize as a problem, and are we using data that they have available, that is available in clinical systems? Because otherwise, there's an enormous risk that we end up developing something that people are just not waiting for or not recognize as, a solution to a problem that they have, or that demands that they provide information that they simply don't have or is not available in clinical systems. So yes, from day one, I would say you have to have those conversations and be very, very critical.
And then the next question we have is from Samuel, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I think you probably answered my question actually. I was just because I'm a clinician and I made a prediction model and it's not implemented, and I was trying to think about reasons why. And I think one of the main reasons is to do with the fact that there's no action based on the model. and there's nothing to do based on the model, as well as the fact that it doesn't use routinely collected data, so the data is hard to actually get to use the model. But you later on talked about that.
Yeah, but it's a good point. And I actually had a couple of slides originally on a study conducted in the Netherlands by Kappen and colleagues, but in the end, I decided that they disrupted the flow of the lecture a little bit. But this is exactly what they found when they evaluated an algorithm that they developed in clinical practice for its impact on clinical decision making. So what they developed didn't have an action linked to it. So basically, the algorithm would just present a risk to the clinician, and it was up to the clinician to do with that what they felt was best. And that didn't work at all. And I don't think that's a surprise. You have to be very clear about what the action is that is linked to high risk. And indeed, also think about what the risk threshold would be. So these are things that you have to consider from the very start, I think. And personally, I also think that's a bit of an omission, for instance, in the tripod guidelines, because it doesn't ask you to identify the target action linked to your model. And I think we should always do that. So even in the development stage of a model, we should already start thinking about that target action and clearly identify it.
And then the next question we have, and I apologize in advance if I mess up the name, it's Dalia or Sedalia?
Yes, Dalia, Nabil.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. I really resonate a lot with your aspects. I did my master thesis on evaluating the national early warning score through ProBust, and I had a lot of concerns because I saw those in practice, and I needed to find the evidence around why is this happening. And I think that mistrust comes from that, is seeing that the prediction scores are failing our decision making and puts us patients at risk and ourselves and our decision making. And I think one of the key things that I would also like to highlight is a lack of transparency on how we are building and with which data from where. So there's this lack of generalizability and other issues, but also how clinicians should be trying to understand how can the model help them in their decision making, rather than just saying, oh, this is here to just, you can rely on this, but rely on which patients, on each cohorts. So understand really how the model was built to make their decision making a little bit more feasible, but also more transparent, and so they can create confidence on specific patients to use the model, and certain specific patients don't use the model. I think for me, what I find the most is that we should tailor the research directly to a specific cohort of patients with the specific data sets, rather than just use a model and duplicate it across the country. What I find interesting is that perhaps the issue relies on research transfer around the lack of commercialization, around research and trying to do these things and then put them in practice, around maybe grants or maybe issues around how this research transfer commercialization is done in universities. But also, I'm wondering how these commercial companies are having so much, easy in a way to go and access to the NHS and many other markets. And actually, some of the models are from the US, so they don't work in the NHS, and they've been implemented. And I think that mistrust also comes from there, because we have researchers, we can make models, but I think they need to be tailored for that specific cohort of patients, specific data set, specific question. For now, maybe in the future, not really, but for now, that's how I see it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Lots and lots of issues, different issues there. I agree with you that that we've got a transferability problem in the sense that very often, if an algorithm is developed in one particular data set from a particular site or perhaps a region, we can't just take it somewhere else. We have to then recalibrate it or even redevelop it because very often the calibration goes off if we transport algorithms, and that's something that we just haven't you know, we haven't got it under control yet. Hopefully in the future that will be better, but at the moment that's where we are. So I agree on that point. Yeah, and I also agree that there's a disconnect, isn't it? So very often, as you say, the findings from academic research do not reach the real world, whereas others, typically from the commercial sector, seem to be, you know, quite good at bringing their stuff into the real world, but it doesn't have, you know, solid roots into research. So there's a real disconnect, and that's a system problem, I would say. I think one aspect of that is that the incentives are not always right. So I think for academic researchers, for instance, the emphasis in incentives is on publications and not on making real world impact. So then it's not really a surprise that it doesn't happen. So yeah, I think lots of very good points, and I agree with your analysis, and clearly some huge challenges still to overcome.
And then the next question we have is from Lingam.
Hi, and thank you, Niels, for your talk. It's a very good talk, and I've been thinking of similar issues with you as well, and because I was more in the industry side. And the question I want to ask is more about, I noticed that there's a delay in the implementation, especially about the infrastructure and the cybersecurity side. And this is a major issue in healthcare because the privacy and the integration of different systems are delayed tremendously. From your experiences, what practical steps or frameworks streamline that can healthcare organizations or institutions take to overcome these challenges? And how can we balance the need for quick approval processes with maintaining strong security measures? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And yeah, I mentioned indeed that that's very often cause of delays. My personal experience as well, that can cause tremendous delays. I actually think that very often the root cause of that is a lack of knowledge and understanding of what's going on, partially with respect to that sensitive healthcare data, and partially with respect to the technology, in this case, AI. And you have to realize there's very, very few people who understand both topics. And ideally, we would have people, for instance, within healthcare organizations who understand both AI, at least to a level that is necessary to make these decisions, and also have a good understanding of information and data governance. And, you know, with that combined knowledge, I think they would be very well placed to speed up the process and reduce those delays. But those kind of people are very hard to find. So what we do find typically is people who are not quite sure because their knowledge is just lacking behind on either or both of those areas. And then they become quite defensive. They become quite conservative in the decision making. And they think, okay, let's not take any risks. Better safe than sorry. And that leads to very defensive decision making, and that's never good for innovation. It slows things down. It makes things more complicated than they really are. That's not really a solution. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question. I hope that, you know, governments and educators can help to increase the skills of the workforce to address these problems.
Thank you, and I think you state the answers very clear. It's not a very mature solution available yet, but yeah, the lack of knowledge and the sensitive combined are indeed a very tremendous delay causing, you know, the root cause. Thank you.
And then the next question we have is from Denise.
Hello, hi, it's Dennis here.
Yeah.
This is actually interesting. It's to build up on your previous question, really. So I fall myself into that camp of sort of being a clinician who is also learning about AI, but also involving kind of in a regional and national developments. And so my question is about the complexity of the environment, and how we educate senior decision makers. Because the reality is that we actually trying something like that to educate clinicians about AI, but this is a so fast developing area that it takes a considerable amount of time, which clinicians do not have, especially somebody in a leadership position. So let's take a triangle of clinical leadership position, and you have to have a certain level of knowledge in terms of ML and sort of AI in general, that would allow you to make a decision. What is your view on education of senior decision makers who perhaps do not have the time, the resources, or anything else to maintain that consistent knowledge? Should we think about creating advisory roles? What is your view?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good point, actually, and it's not an easy problem. Again, for one thing, because people in those positions, they don't have time, right? I do think, though, that I don't think it's necessary to educate people, especially in those types of positions, with respect to a lot of detail when it comes to AI or any other technology. And I'm perhaps also less concerned than you are about the pace with which the technology is developing. The reason is that I think that in those kinds of positions, you have to make sure that you stick to a number of very basic principles. And they don't really depend on the type of technology that you're looking at. The issue that we have is that people sometimes feel intimidated by the technology and the people who are selling the technology, and feel that they have an information, there's a disbalance in the information that they have. I personally think that there's potentially a role for regulators here, but also for us as a community to keep emphasizing that there are some very basic principles when it comes to decision-making about technologies. For instance, I don't think that people should introduce new technology at scale in healthcare organizations if there's no evidence of its effectiveness and sort of impact on clinical outcomes, decision-making, and resources and costs. That would count for any technology. It's not unique to AI or any other technology. It counts for all technologies. But people tend to forget that. So, yeah, I agree with you that it's going to be really hard to educate people at that level. But I'm more optimistic that what we have to tell them, what we need to educate them in, is not that complex.
Thank you. That really resonates, because there was, like, in the last couple of years, there was this was a lot of hype about generative AI, although I think that's a brilliant technology. And then many clinicians and educators feel compelled that they're sort of missing out on something. But the reality of evidence behind actually what it does, how does it improve cost and sort of saves cost and provide some time saving, is very limited evidence, and that makes it quite tricky, actually, into what sort of risks do you want to take, because you don't want to fall into that camp that you mentioned, that you don't take any risks. So that is quite interesting point. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And then the next question we have is from Konstantinos.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. Could you please suggest some resources that could help with the technical side of making a model publicly available? Because we're currently stuck at the pilot stage that you mentioned, and I'm a medical student and my professor is a radiologist. We have some knowledge of machine learning, and we build the model, but now we're kind of stuck how to distribute it and actually make it available publicly. We don't want just to publish it in a paper. That's the point.
So just let me try to see whether I understand the question correctly. So you'd like to make your model publicly available so others can use it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you have any resource that could help us, like how to do that.
And what is the model? What type of model is it?
It's a generative adversarial network for image generation, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
I even have compiled an executable, but I don't know what to do next.
Okay, I will need to think about that one. Would you mind dropping me an email
Sure.
and just repeat the question in your email, and I'll get back to you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and our next question is from Adrian.
Hi, yes. Thanks for a really good, really eye-opening talk, actually. You mentioned at one point that there were, well, a number of problems with models having been trained on research quality data and then not working in practice where the real clinical data is much poorer quality. It just seems quite surprising to me because I guess all the people building these models know that the training data is supposed to be representative of the data it'll be applied on. So how do you think that situation actually arises in practice, and how can it be avoided?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, that is something that people should be aware of. I think still it can be quite tempting if you can get your hands on a good quality data set with which has everything that you need for your problem, then it is quite tempting to use that. I think also that people sometimes underestimate the issues that exist with clinical systems. So it's not unusual, for instance, that the information in clinical systems comes from many different people and different systems as well, subsystems. And there can be inconsistencies in what is there. There can be, serious omissions, information not available, and all of that will vary from one site to the next. So from one hospital to the next. So it's quite a kind of worms. I must admit, I was also a bit surprised when I saw that. Okay, this is something that you can probably avoid, but yeah, I wouldn't underestimate how complex this can be and bewildering if you look at real world data, what a holy mess it can be. So from that perspective, I do understand that people resort to better quality data sets to train their model initially. And yeah, I think that there's probably a step that needs to follow to then make sure it does work in poorer quality data sets. And in that particular study, they clearly forgot that.
Right, okay, yeah. So maybe keeping one eye on the sort of end of the chain at every step along the way.
Yeah.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you.
Then I guess Professor Peak, so I know we do have a few questions more in the chat. I just wanted to check about your availability to take a few more of these, or we can always find a way to email them to you.
Yeah, well, let's take 2 or 3 more and then wrap up. I guess everyone, it's been a long day for everyone.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so Rohan is the next one then.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question was about the difference between integration and adoption of AI models and tools in general between primary practice and also secondary and tertiary care. I know in hospitals you have the ICBs that make a lot of the decisions, and that in itself is a big barrier because I guess they're quite thorough in the way they sort of evaluate these technologies, the risk benefit and also the cost. Whereas so that seems like quite a thorough and prohibitive process. Whereas in GPs and primary care, it all seems a bit more gung-ho, so to speak, in the sense that they have a bit more autonomy over their local decision making. I think consequently, you've actually seen quite a few tools, particularly generative AI tech, being rolled out quite quickly, also in the US, but also sort of slowly infiltrating the UK as well. I was wondering what you might have noticed in your own research, and also what your general position is in terms of how thorough we should be versus evaluating versus just integrating, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point. Thanks for bringing that up. And you're right that primary care can sometimes be quite agile, just much smaller organizations, which makes it easier to innovate. I do think there are other issues. So, for instance, primary care work with what are basically legacy systems, which were developed decades ago and haven't fundamentally changed. And it's within, you know, those legacy electronic health record systems that you have to do your innovation. That's not easy. Whereas certainly some of the secondary and tertiary care centers, hospitals, have you know, cutting edge EPR systems, which then I think make it easier to do really innovative stuff, and there's some very good examples I think across the country. So I think personally the challenges are just very different. I wouldn't say that they're systematically, you know, there's systematically more opportunity for innovation in primary care than in secondary and tertiary care. I know fantastic examples in secondary and tertiary care where people are doing amazing stuff. So I wouldn't say that, but they are just very different. And yeah, you're right that the size of the organization, for instance, in secondary and tertiary care is always going to be something that will slow things down. Although I do hope that, you know, some of those trusts will at some point develop sandpit-like environments where people can deploy and test their AI quickly on a limited scale and for pilot studies. That's typically what is lacking at the moment. And it's not easy to develop such an environment, but I think it would be very, very available if you want to, you know, have a pipeline of AI innovations coming into your trust. That's the kind of environment that you need.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. And then for the last two questions, maybe I can ask both Avija and Marcel to, I guess, both unmute themselves, and then maybe they can be taken a bit together.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk, Niels, and thank you for giving us a break from mathsy and statsy parts this afternoon. So my question is really very simple in general. So in which healthcare fields or areas you think we could expect more development in future, so like cancer or radiology, and equally which areas you think we should not focus and essentially we would waste time looking into it. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, and this is to some extent also a bit personal opinion, but I think that the NHS and other healthcare, other countries should probably try to invest a little bit more in non-clinical AI. I think the emphasis very much has been, certainly in the last decade, on clinical AI, which absolutely has its value. But if you look at the challenges that, for instance, the NHS at the moment has, these are all about the fact that it's an extremely complex organization with massive delays on patient pathways that are basically due to the complex organizational and administrative processes that come with such a complex organization. And I think personally there's tremendous opportunities to use AI to speed up those processes and, for instance, take some of the, frankly, pretty boring tasks that a lot of healthcare professionals have to do out of their hands, let them do by AI, so that clinicians have more time for their patients, and generally patient pathways can be sped up a little bit. So yeah, my personal preference would be to look more into non-clinical applications of AI, or things that are on the boundary of clinical and non-clinical things. So every clinician, for instance, has to do things that are perhaps clinical, but pretty stupid and pretty boring, but still a lot of work. And if AI could pick up some of those things, that would be very helpful for the healthcare system. It's not the most sexy thing to work on as an AI researcher. I totally appreciate that. But in terms of benefit for healthcare services, I think that's where the gains are to be to be had.
Maybe I can continue, Niels, Professor Peek, in the English, of course. Thanks for this very inspiring talk. My question was, is this a plea basically for a cross-domain, cross-sector collaboration, also in education, thinking about the future curricula for the study of medicine, because that could accelerate the learning, right? And reduce the cost and risk where new types of roles come into play, which make projects or R&D efforts way more, successful.
Yes, definitely. I completely agree. This is, and I've not really emphasized that in my talk, but all of this can only work if people from different backgrounds work together, but also if we have people who have skills and knowledge across the boundaries of their own discipline. So, for instance, as you suggest, we have to have doctors with a reasonable understanding of AI and data science, and they can act as real innovators, I think, of healthcare services. And I've in my own work, I've seen tremendous examples of that. But conversely, obviously, for people with a data science or AI background, it's really important to get a good understanding of medicine and healthcare. Otherwise, it's not possible to do anything that is
I can share, Professor Peek, that I'm one of those examples. I think I'm in a really small group, but I can only encourage you and people, maybe interested, to just go out and try, because sports doing that from, the healthcare sector is immense. So I'm growing at a high speed and contributing like crazy. So I can highly encourage you to conduct your research even deeper and people to, step on board. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
And I think with that was the last question. And I think we've seen like a really great discussion. And I think it's really testament to the amazing talk that we've seen today. And I think it's really opened people's perspectives quite a lot, I know, myself specifically. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing all this expertise with us.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for listening and for the great discussion indeed. That was really interesting for me as well.
Thank you. For talk and discussions.